Breitling is a brand that doesn't get talked about much, at least not here in the Mexican or Latin American market, and I honestly have no idea why. But I know there was a time when it lacked presence in Mexico and Latin America, and especially around 2010, it seemed to go through a strange phase. Kind of like you and me when we were 14, 15 years old, wearing all black and telling our mothers it wasn't a phase, something like that. Interestingly, before 2010, Breitling was considered a pillar in watchmaking alongside Rolex and Omega. But what happened in 2010 then? The big problem Breitling faced back then was its bling era. It was a very strange time for many brands, but I think it particularly affected Breitling because they produced a lot of exceptionally large watches, all adorned with diamonds, almost obscenely so, with watches measuring 48 or 50 millimeters filled with diamonds. They also faced another issue that many Swiss houses dealt with, which was the use of generic movements marketed as in-house calibers. It was a very rough time that I'm sure the brand would rather forget. There are brands like IWC that make large watches, but with a purpose. Pilot's watches at 46, 45 millimeters that have historical reasoning behind their size. But the Breitling models from that time were complicated. But since we're on the topic of IWC and the historical legacy of their watches, we get to the secret of Breitling's recent success, hiring the former CEO of IWC, Georges Kern. He understood perfectly what it meant to have a brand full of history with some issues, right? And this is a topic for another video, but IWC was heavily criticized for using Celita movements for a long time. And I promise we will discuss this at another video. But Kern understood all of the history and heritage that a great brand like Breitling possessed. Very few people know that Breitling was essential for the development of horology and aviation, as they made chronographs for planes, and they were the ones who invented the chronograph with a single push button, and they also created the chronograph as we know it today with two pushers and a crown. In fact, we can also thank them for creating the device used to issue the first speeding ticket. Returning to the topic, George Kern recognized the brand's rich history and realized that the trend in recent years was essentially to dive back into the archives and revive previous models. Clearly, the strategy of diamond-studded watches wasn't really working, so he gave it a shift towards a more historical approach. Interestingly, Breitling and IWC faced similar criticism for using basic or generic movements. So for this and many other reasons, Breitling decided to create its own caliber, which is the B01 chronograph. In my opinion, the most beautiful movement available today. The creation of this chronograph was also crucial for the brand as it opened doors for collaboration with other highly regarded houses, as seen in the case with Tudor. Imagine Tudor knocking on Breitling's door saying, "I heard you have a new chronograph, how about you lend it to me?" And Tudor was like, sure, but I need you to lend me your three-handed movement. And each brand modified it and they both claimed it as their in-house movement. And this was a spectacular move because it allowed them to distance themselves from the stigma, if you want to call it that way, of using a generic movement. And both brands ended up with in-house calibers. Now let's move away from corporate gossip, and I just want you to realize how amazing these watches are. First, we have the Breitling Premier, which is the brand's most understated and elegant line, and it's just incredible. I leave the specifications here. And then on the other side, we have this Transocean, and I just remember that Breitling also did the first and reverse panda chronographs for easier visibility for divers. Now, of course, we have historical lines like the Navitimer and the Chronomat, but I think these two watches perfectly demonstrate what Breitling can be and how they are going to revive their future. I mean, they are big watches measuring around 42 to 43 millimeters, but they're not excessively large. They have a touch of vintage inspiration with contemporary features, and I mean, these movements are astonishing. But most importantly, they have a clear understanding of the current market and what consumers really want, which is what matters. As I mentioned, Breitling has a history, much like many of us, that we have faces that we would probably like to forget. However, given the presence they are establishing with these spectacular models, it will be hard not to talk about them in the future. But what do you think?